knowing this, oh,
sorry,
that's all right. But I think knowing this, it gives us an opportunity tonight to come with fresh eyes to our open spaces and to reflect that these LGA boundaries are actually meaningless within the landscape environment. And if we can kind of just think afresh around that, I think there are some wonderful opportunities to the challenges that we're facing. And I think also it gives us an opportunity to look at a sense of place, which is not just about the landscape, it's actually also about infrastructure, and it allows us to connect more greatly to our community, so that I don't think our LGAs should define us. So that was my welcome company. Thank you, Madeline. So first, you know, a little bit about me. I am a first-time independent candidate for Cove's Central Ward. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because we have a fabulous website that has an incredibly amount of comprehensive detail about our policies and our platforms. And we are here tonight to hear from a panel of experts. However, what I will say is that I'm not a career politician. I never thought that I would be here speaking to you tonight as a candidate in the upcoming elections. But I believe that now is the time for people who are passionate about their community and our democratic process to stand up. So I'm here because I can only do so much with the sort of community projects that I've generated so far in my life. And I really want to make a real difference in areas from climate change and sustainability initiatives to increase community engagement and sensible community-driven development, and more accountability and transparency from council. And I want to ensure that one of the jewels in the Cove local government area, our bushland, is actually maintained and enhanced. I certainly don't pretend to have all the answers to the challenges that we face around open space, but I am passionate about engaging community in a participatory democratic process that will enable us to own the choices that are made by council on behalf of us, and that will affect us not just now, but for many decades into the future. And as you know, as I've been speaking on the campaign trail with locals, I was quickly made aware of the pressures of our open spaces and the conflicts that have been arising around this equitable access to space. And that awareness has resulted in this community event tonight. And obviously the level of interest that we've had in the forum has reinforced this. So I'd like to introduce my co-host to the forum tonight, which is Zoe Baker. Zoe, we met, me and my team met Zoe through the Declaration of Independence, which is an initiative by Voices of North Sydney. And we thought that she would be terrific to co-host the event, as having sat as an independent councillor since 2008, we believe that she's able to provide an expert viewpoint on these issues from inside council. So a little bit about Zoe. She was first elected to North Sydney Council in 2008 and was motivated by a desire to improve urban planning and make a difference on environmental issues, and in particularly a terrible and ever-growing lack of public, open and green space. And just as an aside for those of you here in Cove, the latest council annual report, which is being presented to council tonight, shows that since 2017 to 2021, this open space has been reduced per capita from 16.2 square metres to 15 square metres, and it's only going to get more challenging with the development that's happening. So during Zoe's time on council, she's championed precinct planning, in particular the St Leonard's Crow's Nest planning studies, which are delivering the first new open space in decades in the expanded Hume Street Park project, the Educational Precinct Planning Study, and the Ecologically Sustainable Development Best Practice Project. She's also served as Deputy Mayor, Director of Local Government New South Wales from 2013 to 2015. Has been the Chair of the Council's Environmental Reference Group, established and chaired Council's Educational Institutions Working Group, Council's Delegate Community Advisory Group in the St Leonard's Priority Precinct, She's been Council's delegate to Northern Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils, also known as NESROC. She's the chair of the Waverton Peninsula Working Group and has been the chair of Council's Sustainable Transport Working Group. So I think she is more than qualified to be one of our experts tonight, and I'm really looking forward to hearing, you know, her perspective of these from within side as a councillor, from working from within council. So onto our evening. Our first speaker tonight is Rod Simpson. Rod is an architect, planner and urban designer, and was the inaugural Environmental Commissioner from 2016 to 2020 at the Greater Sydney Commission. Oh, I forgot about our stats, Madeline. Maybe we'll just go back a bit. So I guess just going back to when we were surveying the community and realised this was such a big issue. We have surveyed, I think, you know, over 110 people in the area and across all demographics. And this was actually what the results that we got. That what was interesting was that 40% of people, only 40% of people actually wanted more sporting facilities for the community, which is very different to sort of the sort of conversations you're hearing in the community from other areas. But that 75% wanted the council to ensure more equitable use of the existing sporting facilities across our area. So I think that's a way of we can sort of look at this this use of space. And we did get some individual feedback from people. You know, these are sort of some ideas that people, you know, came up with. So, for example, more enclosed areas for dogs. There is a big dog issue around open space here in Lane Cove. There's sort of challenges for young people and access to the recreational areas. So things like, you know, a new skate park, that we have more natural spaces. There are some issues around the golf course, which would be interesting to discuss tonight, and how we can make that open space more equitable, as well as things like, you know, basketball and netball courts, which there's not very many netball courts here at the moment. There's more about this on our website, so you can actually, we've got statistics not just on this issue, but on all of the other issues that we canvassed people. So that's on our website, which I'm sure Madeline can put in the chat later. So back to Rod. Sorry, Rod. So yes, as I said, Rod is an architect, planner and urban designer. And he has also lived in Greenwich all his life. And he started his career in landscape on the Stringy Bark and Flat Rock Creek studies in the office of Harry Howard in the early 1980s. And Rod tonight will be talking about the underlying natural systems and how we need to plan for water, ecology, bushland and passive and active recreation. He believes with good planning, all of these can not only coexist in the same place, but it can actually benefit from each other. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Rod, and over to you.
Thanks very much. It says the host is disabled screen sharing. So Madeline, you might have to allow me to do that, which might just take a moment. So look, thanks so much for the introduction. Here we go. I'll just grab this. Oh no, sorry. I'll just stop share. Sorry about that. Picked the wrong one. Here we go. Okay. That should be sharing now. Can everyone see that? I hope.
Right.
So I'm not quite sure what's happening now. Can everyone hear me okay? And you can all see that first slide?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So from policy of everything that Bridget's just said, but I've been thinking about it, of course, since I was asked to speak. And I guess what it's about is from policy to implementation, because that's actually what local government does. Local government really is where it happens on the ground. And so here you have a beautiful shot looking north to, you know, parts of North Sydney, obviously, and it's from the Sydney Green Grid North District Plan. And in that plan, you can't quite read it, probably up in the top left-hand corner, but it says, planning for open space should be coordinated with the delivery of major projects and infrastructure. Now, no one's going to disagree with that. But the question is, with those sorts of policies, there's a lot. There's a lot of policies that we've already got. When we look at what's actually happening on the ground, here's the local government areas. And again, this is from the wonderful work by the government architect over a number of years to do with the green grid. And what it shows, of course, is the local government areas, and then these, if you like, hotspots in North Sydney, St Leonard's, Crow's Nest, and Chatswood. And the area outlined in red, I'll talk about a little bit more a bit later, because there's a lot of development that's being concentrated in that red area. So this is essentially what we just heard a moment ago about open space needing to accompany other infrastructure, because now we're talking about green infrastructure. And words matter. So everyone's used to paying for grey infrastructure, roads and so forth, and electricity and all the rest of it. But actually what's happening quite seriously in government policy is we recognise that green infrastructure is important for planetary health and for human health. In other words, it's good for people and for the natural systems. And those two things go together indissolubly. And that's what I think we're coming to appreciate more and more. Of course, we've got COP26 breathing down our necks, and there's this very, terrible oppression that we've got, but we've got to keep positive about what we're doing locally, which is going to be probably a little bit more daunting after the next couple of slides, because here we've got the population in the 4 local government areas. Why is it these 4 local government areas? Because I'm involved, as has been mentioned, with a group called Voices of North Sydney, which is the federal electorate of North Sydney. And it comprises the 4 local government areas of North Sydney, Willoughby, Lane Cove and Hunters Hill. And there's about 200,000 people living in those areas right now. But it's actually going to increase by quite a lot. Not so much in Hunters Hill, and it possibly shouldn't. Let's not say it's not fair, Hunters Hill's not getting enough development. I don't think anyone's going to argue for really destroying that really beautiful peninsula. On the other hand, we have got a huge amount of development in Lane Cove at 41%, and most of that is going to be concentrated around St Leonard's. So that was the strategy that was agreed between council and state government. But it's a lot of pressure that's going to come to bear on all of the services, the community facilities and open space and so forth. So we really do need to start think about how we plan things differently. Now, as you just saw a moment ago, I think they might have been different people that were interviewed, but I think it wouldn't matter how many people you interviewed. This is from surveys that Voices did over a number of months at the beginning of this year. And you can see there the issue that really is the most concerning is open space and habitat. After that, there was local government. And then third was overdevelopment, local character and heritage. Now, of course, the first and the third, the green, we're not making any more open space, and overdevelopment, it's not going to stop. So it's not an issue that's just going to magically disappear overnight. So we really need to work together, actually, to work out how we're going to address that. And what extraordinary open space we do have. Now, North Sydney's low on a sort of a per hectare or hectare per 1,000 people basis, which I'll talk about a bit later. But we have got a foreshore. We have got the most incredibly intact and restored natural system. So down in the bottom right is Stringy Bark Creek, for example, which has really come back from being a wasteland of weeds. And it takes years. As you heard, Harry Howard started working, and I think it was, someone might correct me here, I think it was Jim Sturday. I'm pretty sure who was the person in council, and it was really council working with Harry over many, many years, decades actually. And that's how long it takes to actually restore these natural systems and these natural corridors. Bottom left, a wonderful amphitheatre up towards Artarmon in Willoughby. And anyway, you know these sort of places. Post-COVID, I think during COVID, I think everyone got to explore these amazing places where you could literally walk about 15 kilometres through bush as a continuous walk. I mean, that's what we've got. So we could say, and I'm sure many other people in Sydney would say, what on earth are you complaining about? Well, the problem, of course, is that there are going to be a lot of people coming into the area, and we need to share these spaces with them willingly and design so that it can accommodate their needs as well as existing needs. And those needs are changing. Now, I've put some figures over here just to illustrate that we really can't use the old metrics of how we planned. Because the way we used to say was, well, look, there's this many people, we need this many hectares of open space at this sort of rate. Well, look, it's not going to happen. Just in these areas, if you said that we had to provide open space at the old conventional way, it's around about 100 hectares. But let's just say we're going to be clever and reduce that by half. And then we've got some schools, so there's maybe another 8. I mean, it's about $3 billion worth of open space that we'd have to purchase in this area that you see over there on the left. It's not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen because that's $60,000 per person moving into the area. And the point here is that even if you were to say, well, those people should pay for that open space, which is a lot to pay, but anyway, let's say that we said that, where is it going to be? Where is this open space? Where's this magic? Where's it going to appear from? The only place it could possibly appear without demolishing houses, which I think is extremely contentious, as we'd all understand, would perhaps be in the industrial area of Artarmon, perhaps. But that amount of open space simply isn't going to be acquired. So the point here is that we really need to think about making the most use of what we've already got. And that's why a couple of years ago, alongside the Green Grid work, came out a policy called Greener Places from the government architect again, and this is still current. And what it talks about is integration. There's some really fantastic planning words here. We've got integration, we've got connectivity, multifunctionality, and participation. But seriously, this really does cover it across. Why? Well, what it's getting at is when we talk about integration and multifunctionality, let's remember when we came onto this country, there were no fences and there was no subdivision. There were integrated natural systems over which social systems played and people interacted and all the rest of it. There were no boundaries per se. And what we have done, of course, is carve the land up and give responsibility to blocks of land to different agencies who have very specific purposes, whether it's for drainage or whether it's for open space for recreation or schools or hospitals or whatever, or roads. So that's what we've done. And what that means, of course, is that quite often that land only performs one function. So when we talk about integration, we mean actually integrating the thinking of those different landowners and agencies, including local government, that we want this to be continuous and connected because actually getting access to open space is important, but also the trails that are actually continuous open space are incredible in Lane Cove and Willoughby and so on. And when you think about it, what that allows you to do, just as it did during COVID, was to in fact inhabit this part of the city in a completely different way to being in the shopping centre and having a cappuccino or whatever. In other words, it's as though we've got layers of different reality coexisting. And I think that's part of the thinking that we can bring in, that we want things to coexist alongside one another, the natural systems actually still being able to have integrity and for there to be biodiversity and for them to have the integrity in terms of them being sustainable. They will actually be able to look after themselves. Multifunctionality means that we can no longer afford, literally, as you've just seen, to provide a single piece of land for a single purpose. And in deciding that, of course, these are quite contentious issues because, and I'll finish on this later, quite contentious issues, and the only way to really resolve that is through participation and having respectful conversation between different interest groups. And I'll talk about that a bit more. Oh, sorry. So after that, out came the New South Wales Public Spaces Charter. Now, it doesn't say Open Space Charter, it doesn't say Parks Charter, it says Public Spaces Charter. That's important because it's, yes, the public open spaces which we immediately think of, but it's also the public facilities. It's the libraries, it's the schools, museums and so forth. And Also importantly, it's the streets, because we can transform streets. And I'll show some images later of already what's been happening, as you're all familiar with it. I mean, this is an extraordinary part of the city in that respect. And here they are. You know, I mean, okay, there's, I'm not quite sure whether that's in Kirribilli or not. You might be able to tell. No, it looks like City of Sydney somewhere because it's got the green.
Darlinghurst.
It's which one?
Darlinghurst. It's Riley Street.
It's Riley Street, right. But then up in the top right, of course, we've got the area near Helen Street, Reserve in Lane Cove, and then we've got the street over in North Sydney. So those transformations of streets aren't just theoretical, they can actually be achieved. And so with the best of intentions, I mean, it's easy to bash up the state government, but with the best of intentions, really what they then did was go and survey people, recognising that a lot of people aren't as vocal or as organised as others, and ask people what they really wanted. And this is so important. But I think what Bridget's just touched on, and I'm sure Zoe will talk about as well, is that we need to go beyond simply surveys and consultation. We've done that, and here are the results. And what they say is that people want improvements to walking and cycling networks. They want open spaces that feel safe. They want larger open spaces, providing diverse opportunities. They want improvement and extension of tracks along the foreshore. Well, of course they do, because the foreshore is an incredible, I mean, it's, in terms of quality of open space, there's nothing that beats foreshore. I don't think anyone will disagree with me. And we've got kilometres of it. So that then ties in with, of course, what most people actually do for recreation. And yes, it's not necessarily organised sport, and I'm not going to dismiss organised sport, but it's not really the main recreational activity, and certainly not the most common physical activity. Obviously, walking, hiking, jogging, or running, like you can read it yourself if the font's not too small. But you know, this is going to be uploaded anyway. But really, it's all these other things that can occur in very different sorts of open space, and you can see how linear systems along creeks and along foreshores and so forth, and then connecting across from one creek system across the ridge into another, to walk all the way from the Lane Cove River to Flat Rock Creek and then down to Middle Harbour, for example, which I'm sure some of you have actually done during COVID. I mean, the potential is extraordinary. So I think it's fair to say, though, just to come back to sports, you see, we've actually thought of sport and active recreation in a very functionalist way, if you like. You know, it's a land use. It's public recreation. It's where people go to recreate, and that's what it's for. And even better if it's active sports. Now, that's okay, but the reality is we can't just keep on projecting the trends of demand, because it will never be met. It's just impossible. So this is for the whole of the Northern Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. And what it shows is, even conservatively, I haven't pulled up all the figures here, it actually says 163 hectares. Land value in the North Shore is a minimum of about $50 million a hectare, right? Leaving aside then whether it's flat or not, and there's not that much area that's flat on the North Shore, which makes it so beautiful. And nor do we actually want to be resuming people's houses and knocking them down necessarily. So we've really got to work out how to use what we've got better. And so this comes from, it's not anyone's fault, but I'm just pointing out this is the historic way that we've thought about planning for open space. This sort of leftover space, which is bush, there's some mangroves down the bottom, and if they weren't actually reclaimed in the 1930s, well, you know, they might be reclaimed as sort of sports fields. But, you know, look at the sort of open spaces that people actually really use. There's a wonderful coal loader. Again, something that took 20 years to actually plan and implement by local government. Local government had a plan, had advocacy, and then got grants and so forth to assist. But you need that vision. You need to do the drawings. You need to have the framework and strategy so that when an opportunity arises, you know where to go and what to do. And I think that's missing in some of the other local government areas, to be honest. Now, why have I got that image over on the right-hand side? Well, because there's this figure that you'll probably all read about, 2.83 hectares. 2.83 hectares. Where on earth did that come from? Well, 2.83 hectares is 7 acres. Nice round figure, 7 acres. Where does that come from? It comes from the recreational demands determined by the National Playing Fields Association in the early 1930s in Britain to ensure that young boys in particular could walk to their local sports field and have a chance of getting a game. And then it was picked up by the British military when they were doing military camps in terms of providing adequate active recreation. And who did the planning in Canberra and places after the Second World War? Well, a lot of planners actually were trained up in the military. So lo and behold, we got 7 acres, 2.83 hectares per 1,000 people, which included golf courses, I should point out. We'll hear about that more later. Okay, well, what can you do? This is what's happening over the rail line at St Leonard's. Fantastic, absolutely essential. But don't think that we can just do this everywhere. I still haven't managed to get a figure for how much this is costing. But to build over a railway is usually between $15,000 and $20,000 a square metre before you even put in the grass, right? It's extremely expensive. You do it very sparingly. And this is a half of a hectare, 4,750 square metres. Fantastic that it's happening there, but don't get the idea that we can just do it everywhere. Right? It's not that easy. And so when we look at the planning for St Leonard's, which is down in the bottom right left-hand corner there, the red ring is St Leonard's, and down in the bottom there, the green ring is actually Bob Campbell Oval in Greenwich. Hugely contentious. 2,000 signatures saying we don't want synthetic turf, because part of the whole logic of using these open spaces better is to put synthetic turf on them or make them more formalised. And of course, there's a whole cohort of people who walk dogs and run around. And I should point out, every 4 years until COVID, there was the Greenwich Village Games, which is an extraordinary event with around about 2,000 people participating in 2 days of events on natural grass. Now, why has this come about? Well, because there hasn't been strategic planning. In the top right-hand corner, that's the idea that we might be extending this extremely expensive open space northward from St Leonard Station. And it says visionary. I think you could quite fairly say imaginary, or don't believe it, or they got to be dreaming, because it's simply not going to happen. On the other hand, look, again, North Sydney Council at the head of the pack, because it's been confronting these issues for many years, actually. Very innovative planning way back. And this is going right back to the Ted Mack days, you know, where car parks had tennis courts on the roof in Ridge Street, where the busiest basketball courts on top of the Hume Street car park up in Crow's Nest. These are the sorts of facilities that a lot of people actually need and prefer to playing AFL. If you want to play AFL, well, maybe North Sydney's not the place for you to be. Now, here's a really contentious issue. You might have seen in the policy that we've got, and there are other policies saying that we've got to use public space, which includes schools and hospitals and so forth. These are all the primary schools, public primary schools and public high schools in our area. The blue dots are the primary and the dark dots are the high schools. The images on the top is what's happened in the last couple of years at Greenwich Primary School or Infant School, where I went to school. Now, this is a place that everyone in Greenwich learned to ride a bike, practice tennis against the wall and so forth. We simply cannot afford this to happen. Why am I showing it? It's not to have a go at the Department of Education. It's definitely not to have a go at the principal, because they've got a really tough job. It's to point out that this is what happens when you've got a single piece of land for a single purpose, and then people are required to manage it in a certain way. I'm sure, and I haven't approached the principal, I'm sure the principal would appreciate community engagement to think about how we could better use that space. Because remember, $50 million a hectare. And then when we think about the natural systems, again, part of that overall green grid project by the Department of Planning, how do all these green systems link? And of course, how they link is across ridges as well, potentially. So this is Stringy Bark Creek up in the top left there. And my mentor, Harry Howard, what a wonderful way to start a profession, I guess. And so I just couldn't not recognise Harry, and actually the work that Lane Cove started, well, literally probably with the Bushland Preservation Society really advocating for it 50 years ago, and it's their 50th anniversary this year, I think, from memory. I'm not sure whether it was last year, it's such a blur. But what I've shown down the bottom left, of course, is the ridge lines. And so each of those catchments, essentially, that are outlined by those, become places that people are very, very attached to. It's their local bushland backyard. And so, you know, this is where the community cohesion comes in, where the bush regeneration comes in, and so forth. So these overlays of use and meaning are all there ready for us to go. So what does it all mean? Almost finished. We really can't afford to lose any open space. And I think Paul might pick up on that in the next little talk. Different types of activity operate at different scales. Competitive sport operates at a regional scale. You've got to plan for it at a regional scale. If you're playing basketball or, netball, as anyone, I don't play netball, but you know that a competition is basically 32 courts to actually get a competition going. So the scale of this, but also the geographic organisation of these formalised sports actually needs to be thought about on a regional level. Different groups of people advocate for particular activities. Some are really well organised and very vocal, and going back to the Second World War and the planning, things that can actually be put into a set of numbers, and there's going to be this many hours of this many people and it's worth this much and so forth. I mean, economists love it, and so do governments, because they can say, look, here it is, here's the benefit cost analysis, it's bankable. Well, how do you put a value on dog walking? You know, it's pretty difficult.
Sit down.
So,
sit down. Lay down. Lay down.
And most just enjoy the informal use. So what to do? Collaboration across councils for sports, work with the natural systems and catchments, think about the local places, deliberative, inclusive, evidence-based planning, looking for common ground, as opposed to petitions with 2,000 signatures of irate residents versus, another group of residents who want to use it. So the whole way we've been thinking about open space is greater competition for limited resources. And what does that mean usually? It means conflict. I think that's completely wrong. Not necessarily. Different scales, different people, can we have it all? I think we can. I think we can if we have collaboration between councils, a comprehensive understanding of natural systems, place-based participatory planning, and strategies and advocacy, which means that council's always ready if someone comes along with a bag of cash or a grant to say, you know what, we've got the perfect place for this to happen. Or if there's some sort of sports thing, actually, Willoughby, we're on the boundary here. Do we want it in Lane Cove, or do we want it in Willoughby, or should it be in St Leonard's, where actually there's going to be 20,000 people? And so every project actually, and when I say every project, I mean every big transport project, every schools project, every hospital project should be an urban transformation project. Thanks very much. I think that's it. I've run a bit over time, I'm sorry. And I'll stop that share.
Thanks, Rod. I'm going to hand over to Zoe.
Good evening. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Paul Walter, not least because he's an accomplished urban designer and architect who recently served as Vice President of the Australian Institute of Architects. But for those of us from the North Sydney local government area, we know and treasure Paul for his role as Chair of Bay Precinct Committee. And because he has been a strong, sane voice for our community on the impacts of the Western Harbour Tunnel and Northern Beaches Link projects. Paul has an exceptional, incisive approach to the issues that have been confronting our community, from the devastating impacts of these projects on particularly Camaro Park and green spaces. And he has served as an advocate in an environment in which there has been a real vacuum from many of those who have been elected to represent us at local and state level. And so without any further ado, I welcome Paul.
Thanks, Zoe, and thanks, Bridget, for hosting this evening. Look, I'm very happy to be talking to this group, and it's something that I'm thinking and talking about quite a bit, both in my work but also in my community. And it's great to see this sort of wider group thinking about the Lower North Shore more generally. But what I've been asked to do is to talk about a particular instance. It's not a very happy story, I'm sorry to say, about the progress so far on the Beaches and Western Harbour Tunnel project. Can you all see my screen now? Is that share working? Yep, good. So I'm just going to skip through this. I know we're a bit short on time as well, but I just wanted to frame the matter of Camaro Park, which you can see on the bottom left of that view there, which is Camaro Golf Course, and St Leonard's Park you can see just to the north of North Sydney. I think the thing to notice about this place is that it's a really important centre for the whole of Sydney, in fact. It's got the highest concentration of schools, 22 schools, more than 10,000 children, lots of childcare centres, but quite limited green space. And it's the only local government area on the lower North Shore that has less green space than Lane Cove, for our cousins in Lane Cove. So it's an LGA which is short on green space, short on recreation space. And I don't know if you all have been following this project, but it really has quite heavy and negative impacts for the lower North Shore. We're losing connections to the motorway. It's drawing traffic through the CBD. It's really quite a bad news story, unfortunately, for the lower North Shore. And it's really because of the way the project has been thought about is fairly narrowly through a traffic lens. And it's producing all sorts of negative impacts of traffic across the local street system. But there's a particularly acute issue in what's happening at Camaro Park and Camaro Golf Course. And just looking at the picture of how this area has developed over time. So it was created as a Crown Reserve back in the 1800s. And it's the head of Willoughby Creek. I don't know if you might have seen the waterfall behind Primrose Park, but there's an extraordinarily beautiful waterfall that's in the catchment of this creek. But then in the mid-1960s, the motorway cut through the southeastern part of the park, and which is the very significant slice through the ridge top there, which seems like a project of the past, these big wide motorways. And in fact, as the trees have grown up in the decades since then there is some sort of sense that the green space is connecting back, albeit that the motorway still carves through there. So in this view, we can see the CBD off in the distance on the left. It's a fisheye view, but on the right-hand side is St Leonard's. And in fact, it's showing us the land which will be taken for the motorway expansion and control centre, which is the green space that connects Neutral Bay Town Centre with Camaro Village. And all that land is going to, more than 2 hectares of land will be lost to motorway expansion that will take out that lake you can see there, and a new motorway control centre, which will be given over to the motorway operator. We don't know who that will be, but it's the biggest operator in the city at the moment is Transurban. So a green space, which is Crown land and public recreation land, will be exclusively available for the sheds and the trucks of that operation. And that's in an area which is part of the green grid that Rod referred to before, so really excellent state government policy. And you can see here a zoom in that connects North Sydney, St Leonard's Park to Primrose Park and Middle Harbour. And there's those 2 creeks of Flat Rock Creek and Willoughby Creek in that picture. And really extraordinary natural environments deep in the gullies. There's waterfalls and creeks and so on. It's a really extraordinary place. But I think it's important to notice that it's a different kind of place to what you have upon the ridge, where you have transport systems and where the population density is. And looking at the Greater City Regional Plan, the 3rd point there refers to the fact that the use of golf courses may also be examined to provide a wider range of sport and recreation facilities for local communities. And in fact, the current Minister for Open Space and Transport has given radio interviews and so on, and talked about the fact that golf courses need to be thought about in terms of how they are used going into the future. That's thanks to Rod for this slide, but it makes the point that we've got a very significant and steadily growing population picture here with limited space to start with. And then looking at the fact that we have a golf course, which in fact there's 7 golf courses within 7 kilometres of this site. So we're not poor for golf courses. And then looking at the topography, you can see Camaro Park, the 14 hectares of land there where the motorway cuts through the ridge. So this is a rare and valuable place because it's on the ridge and because it's close to Neutral Bay and close to the village of Camaro, surrounded by residents. But then if we zoom in here a bit, you can see there's Ernest Street, and the view on the right-hand side shows you the extent of these large motorway sheds that are going to occupy that public open space, that green space, which is hard to understand, particularly when you consider that at the other end of the tunnel in Rozelle, the very same sheds that serve the same purpose at the other end, in fact, which are going into industrial land in the old White Bay Railway marshalling yards, are actually being covered in a park. And in fact, the motorway is being covered in a park as well. But unfortunately, in the case of Camaro in North Sydney, we're losing park, and it's to be replaced with large-scale industrial sheds. So there's a picture of what we're going to get. You can see in the middle ground. I have to say that to understand what the impacts of this project are in something called an environmental impact statement, but you've got to go hunting through 500 pages of material to try and understand what the actual impacts are. It's very well hidden. But we've identified where is the area that will be lost. We can see that there's what the parkland will be replaced with sheds like the ones on the M5, and you can see the environment that's being lost there. So look, and I'll hop through this, but sort of go to the point that I think there's a very interesting and difficult question here about stewardship of the public estate. This is Crown land that's been in public hands for public purposes for 150 years. And it's just happens to be the case that a golf club has been the tenant on this land for the last 100 or so years. The yellow area is a land area that's worth about $700 million at the going rate. There's 700 members of the club. And when the Department of Transport wanted to take this land off us, this dotted land you can see there, they didn't go to the community, they didn't go to North Sydney Council, they went to the golf club, which is a small group of people who really don't represent the wider community interest that should be represented in a consideration like this. The golf club, for various reasons, has been in financial difficulty over a number of years and has a small and elderly membership. And then when the Department of Transport came to them and said, well, we want to deal with you, and the golf club said, well, okay, you deal with us and can you save us, is the way it appears. You kind of can't blame the golf club for that, for responding that way. However, we now have a situation that this land is going to be lost because there was a weak steward to try and protect this land. If it was any other park that had wider community access and support, there would be a hue and cry at this loss. But as it is, it's in the hands of a weak steward who's done a deal which nobody can see with the Department of Transport to surrender a very significant part of the land. And furthermore, an agreement has been made, which we can't see as well, to build a new golf course on the old site. You can see there are many, many trees, which many of those will be cut down to reconfigure this area as a new golf course on the remnant site. It was already too small, I'm told, for too much of a golf course, but now it's an even smaller one. And the last price that I heard for a golf course was about $1 million a hole. So some several millions of dollars of public money will be spent to reconfigure this site as a new golf course. So the land is under the care and control of North Sydney Council, and they weren't consulted in the arrangements for that. So the lease is due to end in 2026, but we've been told that in fact the new golf course construction is going to start next year in 2022, with only 4 years left on their lease, which is hard to understand. So there's an aerial view of the land that's lost. So they're going to use this larger area for the construction of the tunnel, and then permanently lost will be that area along the motorway. As I say, the motorway operator will have that land there. And I mean, this is really some sort of simple diagrams that you can see the size of. There's the existing soccer field with AstroTurf on it as it happens, but it's not hard to imagine that over those two sheds, which are the two white objects you can see there, could easily be developed as some sort of recreation space on top of those sheds, as is happening in Rozelle, only a short distance away, but is not happening here in North Sydney for we don't know why. there's a little diagram that shows how that might be configured. So there's a whole lot more to say about tunnels and whether tunnels are the right thing to do at this, in this day and age, and promoting traffic and so on. But I think this is a really extraordinary case in point about stewardship and legacy of green open space, and the way the public estate is thought about and cared about, and who's the champion and protector of these spaces. So we've been doing our best to try and raise awareness around this, but so far we haven't had much joy. But that's my happy story for you all. Thank you.
Bridget, I think it's back to you for a second.
Well, yeah, that's it's a bit depressing, isn't it? But I guess one of the questions that for me comes out of that is how we as a community can advocate to ensure these decisions don't happen, or how, you know, what can we do so that this doesn't happen again, or whether there are opportunities around this, you know, moving forward. But quickly, as I know we're running behind, I'd like to introduce Crosbie Lorimer, who is one of Australia's most respected landscape architects. And he's led multidisciplinary teams on projects for some of Australia's key public domain landscapes, including Hyde Park and Centennial Parklands in Sydney and Commonwealth Park in Canberra. And for more than 2 decades, he has also prepared strategic open space and recreation plans and management guidelines for state and local governments across Australia. As the Managing Director of Clouston, Crosby is a regular representative for the AILA on state government committees, juries and panels, and also often called upon as an expert witness in the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, particularly for environmental impact assessments. And we briefly met earlier in the week, and I was very interested in his sort of conceptual viewpoint of the environment and landscape. So I'm really interested to hearing more from you. Over to you, Crosby.
Thank you very much, Bridget. I'll just share screen. And here I'm hoping that I'm going to get this right. Can everybody see that screen? Are you seeing?
Yeah, just you.
Just me, right? That's not a good start, is it? I always hate this bit. Just 1 second. Let's try this. Do we have anything there yet? Can everybody see the waves?
No.
No?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Are we having any luck there?
No.
Oh. I'm a bit lost to know what's happening here. Sorry about this. Just bear with me. It's time we can't afford to be wasting. Aha, try this.
Perfect.
There's something coming up there now.
Yes.
Right. Cool. Sorry about that. And can you see that full screen?
Yes.
Thank you. I have a friend, Professor David Christian at Macquarie University, who has one of the most watched TED Talks in history. And he goes from Big Bang to his grandchildren in 18 minutes. So I reckon I can probably get through this in about 8. So let's see how we go. So what makes for successful public realm? And as I've alluded to earlier there, it is about connections, meaning and purpose. But the starting point, and I think it's one of the really valuable elements that we're now beginning to understand, is connection with country. And why this is important is that it frames the way we see our places very differently. And we've had the good fortune in the last 6 months to work with 2 connecting with country consultants on 3, in fact, extremely different projects. And I can't begin to tell you how much it has broken down barriers of conversations, removed tensions amongst parties, and actually enabled us to see our landscape in very different perspectives. And I include myself as a relatively experienced landscape architect in that. And what goes with that is this extraordinary blossoming of the most amazing writing. For those of you that know the First Knowledges series, it just begins to reshape the way we look at landscape and place. And better still, government architects have produced their draft Connecting with Country under the aegis of Dylan Comber-Mary. And this too is beginning to help us sort of understand how we might look differently and using different language. And what we learned from that is quite a number of things. First of all, is think in a different time scale. At the moment, we seem to think in everything in terms of 3-5-year cycles. And when you look at landscape and public realm, the most successful parts of that have happened over 50, hundreds of years in many cases. It's also happened at all sorts of different scales, from the minute local pinpoint, if you like, right the way through to regional perspectives. And what draws it all together are those connections, and that gives it both purpose and gives it meaning. And that's everything to do with what connecting with country is about. And one of the phrases we use in our practice is seeing landscape as a canvas and not as a frame. And if you use that allegory, and those of you art historians may remember Hans Holbein's Ambassadors painting, and you can imagine the students of that gentleman asked to paint this exquisite piece of rug in the drawing. And this is where we spend a lot of our time in local government and at local levels and at local communities, looking at these little bits of details. But the problem is that that detail is not much use to you if you don't understand the big picture. And so in order for us to understand how we act locally, we have to see that wider picture, or we begin to make foolish decisions that aren't connected. We don't get the balance, we don't get the connections, etc., etc. And if we think of landscape that way and think of it almost like a canvas, the base of the canvas is the water, the sky, the land, and then perhaps the prime canvas is then the various elements of the ecology that move on that, the birds, the animals, and the likes. And it's the detail, is the activity. And the canvas and the prime canvas can endure for thousands of years, and the detail can change continuously, providing we respect and conserve the prime canvas. And so when you deliver that through open space and recreation, the blue-green grid and so on gives us the perfect means to do so. The blue is the water, the green is the green infrastructure, and the grey, if you want to call it that, is all the other pieces, the rail corridors, the easements, canals and other things as well. And we're beginning now to sort of start seeing from top down. There's some cause for some optimism after poor old Paul's bleak story. There are causes for optimism, because in 30 years of this sort of work, I have not myself seen such top-down activity, including through the Greater Sydney Commission, through Department of Planning, through government architects and so on, who produce these extraordinary documents, which really are best practice, better place, greener places, green grid, greener places, and so on. But the challenge for us now is how we bridge that policy down into the local. And that's where the gap happens. And that's all across local government, all across the country. And it has many challenges in terms of the expertise we have available, the ability to work beyond our immediate boundaries, importantly, an understanding of trends, and especially, as others have alluded to, particularly Rod, is matching the demand to the resource, which we seem incapable of doing. We keep asking ourselves to do more with less. Where are our public spaces? We need to think of it in all their forms. So they are all the parklands and gardens, they are the civic spaces, they are the sports facilities, they are the bushland and natural areas, the waterways, and just as importantly, they're the streetscapes. Nature has its place here. These two have natural systems, and we need to think of them that way because they're a critical part of our public domain. And we also need to understand the changing trends. And there's some consistencies there, because as Rod alluded to, walking has been universally the most popular form of recreation ad infinitum. In the 30 years I've been in Australia, about a third, almost consistently, all the way across the country, nationally and indeed in most states and local government areas, about a third community plays sport at any given time. That's a snapshot of a given time. So all of us may have played sports at all sorts of times in our lives, but may not then be playing them now. So it's important we understand that, because that's a critical resource for young people. But it's very important we put in perspective that 2/3 at any given one time are not playing sport. So we need to get that balance right. And there are all the different ways we do it, because at the moment we're still planning around old school thinking around sport. Yet at the same time, we're actually doing it completely differently. And instead of getting more land hungry, it's actually getting less, but we're not planning the way we're doing that. And of course, we all wear more than one hat. So dog people can be sports people too, and we really need to take the hats off and look at that widely. And here are all of these things that are helping us, the green grid, taking it down to its local level and bringing it through those scales. So that as we've done here, you bring it right the way down to the local scale. Here we did at Camden. And those things can happen across an LGA, and I'm happy to talk to this if there are questions. But at RIDE, we did exactly that. And it was a 150-page document. In 2011, it won the Premier's Award for Green Space. And this one map pretty much showed everything that was in that plan. It's not rocket science. And if you build up from the natural canvas, you start looking at the catchments of walking, you look at the attractors and generators, you work through the built corridors, you work out a parks hierarchy, and you start joining the dots, you can get a network that doesn't require you to have stats. It just needs some very simple metrics. And mostly those are accessibility, the distance to walk or ride, the hierarchy. God knows we have tiers and tiers of different hierarchies, and just managing 3 is enough. And then the sizes of each of those. And once you've got those 3 parameters, you can basically plan out across an LGA, across a region, as we did with RIDE. And then you've got to have the requirement to really keep playing in that and hold to that plan. So what then gives all of that meaning? Well, first of all, it's got to be relevant. So if we're planning these connections, they're connecting places that are part of our daily routines. We need the connection. So that was what makes it relevant. We need that connection with nature, with the past, and then also with others. And then finally, we've kind of got to create spaces that are memorable. They reside in our minds just as much as they do in reality. I've not been in England for 30 years, but I just have this vivid memory of my childhood countryside. It's in my mind. I don't need the physical presence to love and enjoy it still. So how do we get there? First of all, I think we really, and this is the participatory process, we need to embrace complexity. There are no simple answers. As Bridget said, I don't have the answers any more than most. I just simply have talked to more people. Encourage debate. All too often we ask people what they want. We don't ask them to debate with each other about how we're going to get there. The best facilitators draw that out, and they're not afraid of people arguing, because that's what we need. We need constructive debate. You need to find your story keepers, and they're not the ones who are shouting the loudest. In fact, most of the best story keepers, the people who really know what's gone on in a place, are much older than me, and very often are quiet people who just simply have that determination to keep at it. We need to be patient. We do need to think in those longer time frames, and in the end, we must be hopeful about this, because there is a good reason to be so. So lastly, what about for you? This was just an hour's sketch, but it picks up all the points Rod's making, is that we've got all of these little, if you like, in Sydney city form, a city of villages, and those in themselves have got all the opportunity to be wonderful places to be, but it's actually how we connect them, both with the existing corridors, but also with the streets, because actually you can, a bit like Healing Country, you can bring back those old connections, even if they've long since gone, by actually representing them in different ways through connections of trees, vegetation, peaceful spaces, and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure how much that's helped, but I hope that gives you some idea of the way we think about these things, and it's simple, really.
Thank you so much, Crosby. It was great. And you did say to us that you're a glass half full kind of person. So that's well timed to be after Paul. And Paul, it's not a needed person, but you just had to, I guess, for a lot of people, that was probably news about what was going on at Camaro Golf Course. So can everyone, need to go back to sharing my screen? Might need you to stop sharing.
Yes, I think I've, just 1 second, stop share, there we go.
There we go. So just for the next part, I'm just introducing myself. So I'm running as part of Bridget Kennedy's independent team for Lane Cove Council. So we're in Central Ward and I'm number 2. And next, I'm sure you've all got some questions. I know I have. So we're just going to see if everyone can join us again to have a little bit of a chat. And first, I just wanted to start with, and I'm sure everyone is kind of thinking this, is what's been coming up again and again is how much we seem to be at the mercy of decisions made by state government. So Zoe has been a councillor for over 12 years now, and I'm curious as to hear what her perspective is on what, councillors and independent councillors perhaps can do in this area to push back where needed.
Thank you. That's a very big topic that you've given me to start with. I think it's essential to have councils that are majority community independent minded, because no matter who's in power, they're prepared to stand up for their community to state government over lots of issues, but particularly on these sorts of issues about public open space. And when you look at the good news stories that particularly that Rod and that I can speak to in North Sydney, that Rod and Crosby both referred to, which is, for example, the Waverton Peninsula. That's a very long-term process of a succession of community-dominated councils at North Sydney, having stood up to a variety of state governments, both Labor and Liberal, through supporting the community in the community fight for those lands, for then putting the resources and prioritising the resources of the council into planning for the long-term use of those lands, for having, as I think it was Rod who talked about having designs ready so that when the bag of money can be grasped that you're continually fighting for, it can be delivered, and a commitment to delivering and delivering for the community, and never giving up, because it's a council and community representatives who are very responsive to the voices of their own community, and they're not prepared to lay down because they have an allegiance to a particular party who may be in power and it's uncomfortable to continue pressing on. And so it does feel overwhelming when we look at what's happening in Camaro Park and with the Western Harbour Tunnel and Northern Beaches Link. And I sometimes sound as if I'm Pollyanna, but I'm very optimistic about the battle that's ongoing. One, because of the strength and commitment and intelligence and strategic capability of the people in our community. The missing link on that fight over the last 4 years has been that we've had a council that hasn't been dominated by community independence. We've had a council who's been reluctant to really call out and challenge the state government over that project. And so I suppose my broad response is having local government is a level of government that I think really shouldn't have party politics in it, because we really are about implementing things that are important to where we live and where we work and how we, and not only that, there's a specific requirement under the Local Government Act for elected representatives to be shepherds of the public estate, and also to have an eye towards intergenerational equity. And so if you're not professional politicians or beholden to vested interests and parties, I think you're more likely, and certainly in the history of North Sydney, and I know of Lane Cove, that when you have councils, and it's a succession of councils who have that character, we have better outcomes for our community, because it isn't all about getting re-elected in 4 years and moving up the political ladder or pleasing the masters in Macquarie Street.
Thanks, Zoe. Bridget, I might just throw to you. So as someone who's, I guess, new to this space, what's your take on, I guess, what's happening in Lane Cove and what you might do as a councillor if you're elected to help deal with some of the, I think we're not calling it tension. A lot of it, as we've been saying, is confusion, because as you said, a lot of people are both dog owners and sports club people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just by holding this forum tonight is a way of showing what we would do and how we would behave, how we would behave as an elected representative. I believe, as I said earlier, I don't know the answers. I'm very new to this, but I am absolutely passionate about engaging people that have creative ideas about how we can move forward with this and bringing along the community in the decision-making process. Although, yes, it was a bit of a downer for, what's happening in Camaro. Again, Zoe, I think I'm pretty excited by some of the ideas and opportunities, and certainly tonight has increased my knowledge of the local landscape and how all of these different layers can work together. On a personal note, I'm a gardener, so when I look, and I love gardening, and when I've run out of horizontal space, because we're still sort of thinking horizontally here, that you know, there are other creative solutions to this. You know, you can go vertically. I mean, like the tennis courts and the football courts that are on roofs of things. And I think that we do have creative solutions, and we do have, you know, I think this is an exciting time, but it does involve bringing the community along, and it involves calling on the resources we have and the rich knowledge and the depth of knowledge that we have in the community.
Just before I just open up for any of the community to ask questions, one thing that I'd be interested to get people's perspectives of, obviously we're holding this event with 2 councils areas, and we've very much taken it from a higher level. So, you know, I'm not sure if, you know, Rod or Paul or Crosby, if you could throw in, like, what impact will it make if we do look at that level and start making those decisions, do you think? And how much is that happening already in terms of these councils working together strategically?
Oh, look, I've spoken at length already. But look, there are great organisations like NSROC, which is the Northern Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. There's that. But look, the point I'd make, if I may, and I'll be very short, which is you don't need council amalgamations for people to collaborate and work together. You know, a lot can be achieved through collaboration, and that's really the key here. That having an overall framework, working out where it does make sense to, you know, in Lane Cove, we're talking, I'm not talking, but it's being talked about, you know, there being a very big sports centre, about $60 million. There's no business case. So the question has to be asked, is that the best place for that to be when there's 20,000 people going into St Leonard's? When, to your point, Madeline and Bridget, you know, that surely on a couple of rooftops, some pretty significant facilities, you know, the reason it's on the rooftop is because they're lightweight roofs, right? So you put the lightweight structure on top of the heavyweight structure. It's entirely doable, you know, it's really pretty easy to do, actually. And you think, look, if we're going to have a really intense urban area like St Leonard's, let's make it really intense and urban. And I personally think there shouldn't be any cars, for example. It should only be walking. And you say, right, well, this is a pedestrian-only area. It's got a different sort of it's a different way of living. You know, we've got to think of the city as being a mosaic of different ways of living. And you choose where, if you want to play AFL, don't live in St Leonard's, you know, like go somewhere where there's big open spaces. And so if you want to surf, you don't go and live in, you know, Blacktown or Liverpool. You know, that's... So the wonderful thing about Sydney is that it is this incredible mosaic of different living conditions, and it's becoming more varied. And I think, well, that's what we've got to do with the place-based planning, you know, is really start to articulate that every place has got its own potentials and work with people to say, how do we really optimise, you know, what could possibly happen in this place? And it won't be for everyone. We don't want to dumb it down so that it's going to appeal to the widest market. It might only be 20,000 people that are interested in living there under those particular conditions. That's fine. We've got, you know, close to 5 million people who want to live in Sydney. So anyway, that's enough from me.
Madeline, I might take that up too, if you don't mind, which is to say, I think a mosaic's a good way of thinking about it. And there are different concerns that operate at different levels, of course. And I know that Zoe's been very involved and supportive around the precinct system, the precinct committee system, which is a way that in North Sydney communities do organise themselves. And the way that it makes sense to organise yourself is actually geographic. It's around these open spaces and it's around the villages that people tend to associate and tend to connect. So it's working at that scale within our valleys, within our precincts, as well as that wider frame. And it's interesting, it's the places on top of the ridges where the various communities intersect that you can have a situation of sort of weak stewardship, where you need that sort of wider connection. And I really think, I mean, I told a pretty dismal story before about Camaro Park, but I think there's a real opportunity here for sow's ears into silk purses. I think if that area, you know, becomes a place for the whole community and is reimagined as part of this process, then we can really turn it around. That's certainly the feeling that I'm getting. And in fact, I have to give fantastic credit to Zoe for the way this process around the trade-off between the loss of green space at Camaro Park and a false trade actually with what's happening at Waverton was she said this has to be a public process. We have to have the community engaged in thinking about our community open space. So that kind of thinking and having awareness and going to the grassroots through the precincts is, I think, the right way to get decision making and to get buy-in from the community.
And I think one thing on that, I'll just mention that people don't know, is in the first term of council, you work on your new community strategic plan and community engagement plan. And I know that's something that we're really excited about, because that gives the opportunity to change what has been happening. And Lane Cove, I know people are quite frustrated. Rod mentioned that there was the sports centre with no consultation, a $57 million DA. So we're looking at, I think there's lots of conversations about how that could change. Zoe, sorry, you were going to jump in there.
I just wanted to jump on what Paul was saying. We're seeing it at every level of government in Australia, and it's unfortunately leaked into local government where it's never had a place. But we're increasingly having a lack of real public participation in decision making in a context in which there's absolute a lack of any transparency. And so the example that Paul gave was that the negotiations about this piece of 2.5 hectares of public land at Camaro is being done under confidential arrangements between a lessee from the council and the state government. Similarly, the state government has promised for many, many years to give, for 30 plus years, to give the remnants, 2 hectares actually, of public foreshore lands at on the Waverton Peninsula to complete the public lands on that Waverton Peninsula. And yet, at the time, they're doing a divide and conquer. They're wanting to negotiate behind closed doors with the council about a land swap in the context of their tunnels project, which would have meant that the council would have been forced to make a decision to say, well, in lieu of 2.5 hectares in Camaro, we're going to take the totally unrelated issue of the provision of other public lands in Waverton. And so I think one of the really important things about independence is there is a tradition in the independent representation at council levels across Sydney of demanding transparency, demanding that the community be not just spectators to the decision makers, but the intrinsic part of decision making and policy making. And it can be difficult. The conversations that we have can't be held in three-line slogans. They can sometimes be angry conversations, but having those conversations usually reconciles those who have participated to the ultimate outcome. So I think to me, it's really vital at these local government elections across the state that we have a bit of a sea change we return to a commitment to real transparency in government and decision making. And in the 70s, the councils like North Sydney Council led the way, and we have to go back to it to be able to hold, not only hold state government to account, but to actually deliver on public benefits across metropolitan Sydney to accompany the great overdevelopment and great density that we're being required to meet.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm just quickly, I know we're running a bit over time, but I was just wondering, there's been a few questions in the chat that Brooke's been doing a great job moderating. I was just wondering if anyone else has any. Put your hand up. Oh,
can we add to what has just been said, that this is very important to have so many independents coming in and wanting to be candidates, because the general managers often are the ones that run the council after the decision's been made, because they make the final decision. And I think that's what we've got to be very careful of, and we need independents to stand up to them.
Well, Frank, I'm not sure if you're from Lane Cove, but I'd love your vote.
Longueville.
Longueville, yes.
I didn't want to mention the name of the council.
It's not exclusive to Lane Cove.
This is what they tend to do.
I think we met Virginia at the church the other day morning.
Oh, right, yes, hi.
Okay, was there any other questions? It's true, the term independent is a loose term. That is a good comment. Marcus, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me. I can't see myself. Very good presentations and very good session from everybody. I was just curious about something that Rod was talking about. Hey, Rod. You had a picture of schools and some railings around the schools, and I'm not sure if I missed your point, but was it that you didn't like the fact that schools were being fenced off and therefore that land was not available to the community?
Exactly. I mean, and it's we can't afford to have those facilities locked up, and I understand completely. I mean, what's happened is a lot of press has been put back onto principals to manage. You know, they used to teach and manage staff, and now they're meant to be property managers and security managers and all the rest of it. So I'm not for a moment suggesting they don't have a really tough time. But again, this goes to where there can possibly be collaboration, because the policy is that schools should be made available for community uses. You know, and there's various guidelines and so on, but it actually, you know, they need help. You know, so the linking up of P&Cs, and this happens to a certain extent. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it really is crunch time. You know, when you look at those facilities, they have fantastic play equipment. You know, joint use for agreements with local government. I mean, it's all there in the policy, which is why, you know, I termed what I was talking about going from policy down to, you know, implementation, because it's actually local government, the local community, working back up sometimes to state agencies, in this case Department of Education, but it's actually it's the locals that are doing that. So it's unavoidable, and that needs to be done possibly at the instigation of local government. You know, I think local government has just that incredible role of knowing what's going on the ground, what people want and need. So a sort of catalyst. It doesn't mean necessarily that council's even paying for it, but that advocacy is so important that Zoe was talking about. And look, let's remember, that's what it says in the Local Government Act. You know, I mean, the local government exists as an instrument of state government, but it's wrong to think of it that way. You know, it's created by the state government, but it actually isn't an instrument of state government. Its primary responsibility is to think about the existing and future needs of the community and essentially to advocate for those needs. And so that's, you know.
Thanks, Rod. I'll just that reminds me of something I was reading a few weeks ago in the US, where they're trying to tackle the same problem. It might be of interest. It does seem to be a bit of a hard nut to crack.
It's Marcus, if I may jump in there. There are models all around the country that have been around for years. If anybody's been to Mawson Lakes in South Australia, there's a public footpath right through the middle of the primary school. I mean, you know, it can be done. It literally is just beginning to kind of abandon some of the paradigms we seem to be intent on, and actually seeing and managing it in a very different way. So I think we should, again, you know, my cause for optimism is there's so many places where this stuff is done. It takes a certain amount of bravery and then really good solid work to make sure that you can deliver it and deliver it safely. So the models are there.
Hi, Rod.
Hi.
It's Katie and John.
Who do we have talking now? So I can't see.
Sorry, it's Katie and John. We would also just to go further on that model of open space needs, just, you know, I'd be interested to know what other models there are around the world.
Look, there are lots of...
Can I talk to that one, Rod?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Other models that we can look to, as you know, North Sydney Council, Lane Cove Council, what other models can we look to as best practice, really?
I think some of the best, Katie, if I can jump in there, because I do a fair bit of work in this from all around the world. There are models from around the world, but actually there are probably some of the world's best practices are here in Australia, but they're just parked in all sorts of different places. So for instance, in the late 90s and early 2000s, WA probably did some of the best work. There are elements of good work coming out of South Australia. There's been certain elements come out of Queensland. I think the problem in the end is, and you'll find it when you look everywhere around the world, is that you'll find small pieces of the jigsaw, but not necessarily a total. And I think that's why it's so important to sort of understand both the governance structures, where you are, and the landscape and all of those overlays to say, yes, that principle from that might be right, but how do we apply it here? And I think, yes, absolutely, we should be looking at it, but I don't think we need to necessarily go off to all parts of the world to find some very good examples from around here. Many of the councils we've even worked for in places like Ipswich in Queensland in the 1990s, probably one of the best open space strategies I've ever seen. You know, so I think there's plenty of good stuff going on here, as well as stuff which we're getting interesting ideas from United Kingdom, probably some of the best of it, I think, from my experience, and occasionally from New Zealand as well.
If I could just say, the conundrum that Rod's talking about the use of other state public spaces. So, for example, North Sydney Demonstration School until recently was like Greenwich. It had open gates, and it became an extension of a playground in a fairly high density area. In other parts of the country, like in South Australia, when they design new schools, they design them so that they're outward facing and able to be accessed by the public, so that all of those issues about protection of children can be physically managed, so that you can have multiple uses as a community of those spaces. And the same can happen in hospital grounds as well. And in fact, under the District North Plan, the state government overly relies on the existing public open space around Royal North Shore Hospital as the compensation for the terrible density that Lane Cove, Willoughby and North Sydney are facing in St Leonard. So I think increasingly it's that, I think it will be local government demanding it of state government that in their own design and approach to their properties, that they provide some of those local facilities that have been missing.
I think we've probably got time for one more question. I think Mary had her hand up first, and then I'll throw back to Bridget to wrap things up. Sorry, Sarah. I feel like if we have some questions, maybe people can email them after and we can get some answers for you too.
I'm sorry, I've just come back from a very depressing Lane Cove Council meeting, which goes to the question, address the whole issue of lack of consultation. I'm sorry, I've come in very late at this for that reason. Is there a clear model for open space in urban renewal areas as opposed to just general greenfield sort of sites? Because I think there is a real issue around this particular part of the world. Is there such a thing as an open space model for urban renewal? I'm sorry if it's already been covered. Somebody might have already addressed that.
Look, really briefly, Mary, this was a thing that we really struggled with when we were doing the regional plan. One thing I think, well, I managed to argue that in higher density areas, people should be within 200 metres of an open space. And the thinking there was that if you're living in an apartment, or even for that matter, row housing with very small courtyards or whatever, you really need to be not even 5 minutes, 2.5 minutes away, which means that if you've got kids, it's actually very, it's really accessible. And dare I say it, that was based, okay, this is a bit random, but it's based on principles for the design of Islamic cities. And in Islamic cities, mosques are meant to be within 150 metres of every house, because then people can incorporate the prayer 5 times a day into their daily lives. So if we think of open space as being the same sort of proximity and need and incorporate it into our daily lives, it means it needs to be right there, really easy to get to without crossing major roads and so forth. So it's not going to be a quantity. It's not going to be the old 2.837 acres. That doesn't make sense, and it's impossible, which is what I was really trying to illustrate. It's then where the streets and turning those into beautiful recreational facilities, but then of course, yes, the little pocket parks. And so, look, in the case of St Leonard South, I really don't think that cuts it, what's been proposed there. And there's a whole lot of issues with that, which we haven't got time to go into, but it does go to when that open space is provided, because I think there's a very strong argument that it should be provided from basically day one, rather than waiting for 70% of the units to be built. I don't think that's a fair go at all. So there's no particular guideline, but Crosby, you might like to jump in there too, because this is really your extreme expertise.
I'll just very briefly, exactly what you were saying about the walking catchments. So those have been coming down. And interestingly, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of the final greener places out of the government architects, because in fact, several things are happening in the various drafts they're doing now. Is for inner urban areas, those numbers are coming down, as you said, closer to 200, and indeed arguably for 150. But also the amount of open space requirements is going up. So we had 0.3 of a hectare, and I think that's heading north again, which is good. So I think there are definitely models coming out. We probably will know in the next few months actually where that's landing. It'll be interesting to see.
It's very important that local government advocates for this and the community advocates for this, because there's pushback from the development industry. There's no question about that. And it does require forward planning. And actually the contribution schemes and so forth that have been reviewed recently, the timing of this becomes critical. So in all of these things, it is important to have an informed discussion and push back, and to help local government councillors actually to put the case of the community to the state government. You know, and going back to the schools, I mean, the policies are actually there. It's a matter of actually bringing them up to the surface and then saying, well, look, this is what it says. Here's the policy. It says that this is what you're trying to achieve. And that was really the main point I was trying to make. The policy frameworks and the intentions there, it's now a matter of getting the community to say, well, okay, let's do it. Let's see the colour of your money, which happens to be green.
Well, I think we probably do need to wrap up now. Obviously, this is an important issue and an important conversation to keep having. And, you know, one of the things I think that with the independents is that we are engaged with the community and we want to actually see this change happen from a grassroots level. And it's important to keep these conversations going. And I mean, I found that there are, from just the last 6 months journey that I've been on, that I have met some, you know, I've met you, Rod, and, you know, I've met now Crosby and Paul and Zoe, and I've met some incredibly knowledgeable and wise people that have so much to contribute. And it feels that at the moment, local government, we're not being allowed to make that contribution. So I would definitely be a stand for changing that. I think that it's now 9:30. We will have this recorded, and Madeline, I'm not sure where it's going to be sent to, whether it's going to be sent to the participants or on a website somewhere, but we'll let you know. And I just want to say thank you all for coming. Like, I'm actually pretty excited. I think there are some opportunities here and different ways, you know, as I said right at the start, that we're not defined by the LGA that we live in. You know, we're part of a bigger environment and a bigger landscape. And I think if we can think of open space from that perspective, like the rivers and the, you know, I think that's really exciting. And I think that it does open up amazing opportunities and amazing creative solutions. And, you know, I'd love to be a part of that. So thank you all. Thank you.
If I could be just very prosaic, there's an election on the 4th of December. and that this is the only way that we make these changes, and that these sorts of conversations become the norm in the local government areas that we live in, and that we have councils who are prepared to do these things on our behalf, and that we have councillors who will be held to account. So all I would say is, if you're in Lane Cove, it's really important that you vote for the true independents who are standing in the various wards. I know Bridget is one, and I can see Mary Southwood there. They're people who are champions of the community, and I would ask that those in North Sydney do the same for the only true independent team who are running, which is the Real Independent team. I'm heading that in St Leonard's ward, and Mary Ann Berrigy is heading that in Camaro. So, but know who you're voting for, and then hold them to account for the next 2 years and 9 months.
And as I mentioned, I'll be sending a post-event survey that will have links to the Voice of North Sydney records of all the people who have signed the Independence Declaration, so have committed to being community-focused independents in Willoughby Council, Hunters Hill, North Sydney Council and Lane Cove Council. So it's worth checking out and sharing that. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
All power to your elbows, girls.
Thanks very much. Yeah, strength to your arm.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, team.
Right.